In his landmark book, Antiquities of the Southern Indians, 19th century historian Charles C. Jones stated that when European settlers arrived in northern and central Georgia after the American Revolution, the region was dotted with Indian mounds, ceremony earthworks, abandoned town sites, stone mounds, stone cairns, stone terraces, walls, and even the ruins of stone buildings. Stone ruins were endemic as far south as the fall line. Large mounds seem to be concentrated in regional capitals built in the past, but small mounds and stone cairns were too numerous to count. Stone ruins were endemic north of the fall line. No one knew who had built the large mounds and stone structures. Within a generation, most of the stone ruins in the Piedmont had been converted into chimneys and into the foundations of houses and commercial structures. It was assumed that the Indians who occupied Georgia at the time of the colonization were too indolent and backward to have constructed such projects. 19th century settlers speculated that the large mounds and stone structures had been built by an extinct race either from Mexico or from Europe. Late 20th century archaeologists attempted to ignore the stone ruins because they didn't understand them. Many were destroyed in the Atlanta metropolitan area in the late 20th century because archaeologists refused to label them historic. Concerned elected officials were powerless to stop the demolition of these stone ruins, no matter how ancient they were, without this important historic designation. Ancient stone ruins and mounds still exist throughout rural areas of North Georgia, but they're the most prevalent in the north central and northeast mountains, where the rugged landscape prevented widespread agriculture. Here, both in the national forest lands and the privately owned tracts, one can find hundreds of earthen and stone masonry ruins that have been forgotten by time. Most are completely unknown to the current generation of archaeologists. In this program, we will travel to a valley where there is indeed a lost world. For Indians, it was an uninhabitable land of fire and brimstone. This fire baptism of the landscape is the reason today that gold, copper, rubies, quartz crystals, garnets, and other semi-precious stones are abundant in northeast Georgia. Large diamonds have also been found in the past. Beginning at least 250 million years ago, dozens of volcanoes, large and small, belched smoke, fire, and lava upon the earth. Some of the early mountains were as large as any we have today on Earth. All that remains of them are layers of granite under the earth and an occasional modest peak that is sprinkled around the Atlanta metropolitan area. As the oldest disappeared, new volcanoes arose from the flanks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Those youngest volcanoes are still very visible. Other ancient volcanoes are exposed knobs of igneous rock, like Yonah Mountain in the Coochie Valley, plus Stone and Panola Mountains in metro Atlanta. The Coochie Valley was actually created by a line of newer volcanoes which formed parallel to the Blue Ridge Mountains. Here you can see them from a view from Testnotee Gap, which is north of the Coochie Valley. This is a view of Chimney Mountain, which actually arises from the flank of the Blue Ridge Mountains near Batesville, Georgia. The view is from the Saltee Valley in the community of Saltee. This is Rabin's Knob Mountain in Rabin County. It is northeast of Chimney Mountain. It appears to be a very ancient volcano which later had a young volcano push out from the top as a little knob on the left at the top of the mountain. This is a view of the top knob of Yonah Mountain looking from the west, made with a drone camera. This is a view of Stone Mountain in East Metro Atlanta, taken from an airplane. Technically, it's a monadnock, which means it's a granite core that pushed up from the earth and then was exposed by erosion through the eons. This is approximately what the Coochie Valley would have looked like during the time of the dinosaurs. There's a reason why very few fossils are found in northeast and north central Georgia. For hundreds of millions of years, the mountains in the region were too high and too cold for early forms of life to thrive. They definitely were as tall as the Rockies and possibly as tall as the Andes. Some volcanoes continue to belch smoke, ash, and lava, but not with the intensity of earlier ages. 19th and 20th century scientists were only vaguely aware of the volcanic origins of northeast Georgia, really until 1955. That's when state geologists began to survey the region seriously. They discovered that northwestern Habersham County and northeastern White County were covered by rhyolite, a type of volcanic stone associated with caldera-type volcanoes. Calderas are usually several miles across and tend to erupt with explosions that can destroy all living things for many miles around. In 1971, Jesse H. Averill Jr. and Robert D. Hatcher Jr., geologists employed by the state of Georgia, carried out a more thorough geological survey of northeast Georgia, although it really involved driving up and down the public roads and looking at road cuts. That's not exactly the same thing as we actually need, but that's what they did. They discovered an igneous dome, which they called Tallulah Falls Dome, which stretched 18 miles across. It is probably the remnants of an ancient massive caldera. The men also discovered several major and minor fault lines, which they assume are inactive, but we never really know. This is a satellite image of the Alec Mountain caldera. It is a younger caldera than the much larger one that covers most of northwestern Habersham County. This one is about 2 to 3 miles in diameter, depending on where you take the measurement. It is quite old, though. It's not a new caldera. I first heard about the volcanic zone in northeast Georgia while a student at Georgia Tech. Our professor, who was also a state geologist, took us on a field trip to northeast Georgia first to show us the ancient volcanic cones. Then we traveled past Dahlonega, which also has some volcanic cones, and on to northwest Georgia, where you could see a fault line very visible at the surface going under Carter's Dam and then out the other side. That's right, they built a dam on top of a fault. However, if a geology textbook or map even mentions the tectonic zone in northeast Georgia today, they inform the reader that the eruptions occurred between 250 and 100 million years ago. Also that these volcanoes and adjacent fault lines have been extinct for eons. In the fall of 2018, I started construction of garden terraces on my new property atop a ridge extending westward from Alec Mountain. I immediately began finding lava bombs in the topsoil. These are potato-shaped rocks composed of either black scoria, brown scoria, red scoria, or white pumice. I'd seen these stones near recent volcanic eruptions in Mexico and wondered what they were doing in my soil. The mystery furthered when at several locations I found large deposits of golden-colored sand between the topsoil and the red clay that sits atop the volcanic bedrock. One should not be finding sand on top of a mountain, at least in North Georgia. I then found photos of identical sand online which said they were volcanic ash. I first called my alma mater Georgia Tech. The geology professor said he didn't know much about the geology of Georgia he was from another part of the country and specialized in the geology of Quebec and upstate New York. I called my other alma mater, Georgia State University. The geology professor there said that he didn't know much about the geology of Georgia and specialized in the geology of Central Africa. I then called the geology department at the University of Georgia. The professor first asked if I was that crazy Maya guy on the History Channel program. I didn't ask him directly, but I said that, like most Georgia Creeks, I'm part Maya. But my question was about geology, specifically volcanic rocks in northeast Georgia. He said he didn't want to get involved in that Maya thing and was busy. He then hung up the phone. I then sent photos to the U.S. Geological Survey in Reston, Virginia, of the volcanic rocks which compose the new wall in my front yard, plus detailed photos of the volcanic ash, scoria, and pumice lava bombs that I found in the topsoil. About 2 weeks later, I received a telephone call from a person there. She immediately demanded to know where I obtained the rocks. I told her on my yard in a mountaintop in Georgia. She then accused me of stealing the rocks from federal land around Mount St. Helens and reminded me that theft of rocks from federal land is a felony. I invited her to come look at my wall, but she said that she was busy and didn't have time to bother with such nonsense. She knew for a fact there had not been major volcanoes in Georgia for 160 million years. Mount St. Helens, so these lava bombs were young. After I did get confirmation from people around Batesville that Chimney Mountain had emitted smoke until the 1880s, and that they have frequent tremors around Batesville. Obviously, there's a dormant volcano nearby and it's not extinct like the geologists think. The geologists need to come by and do a much more thorough survey of this region so we know what's going on. Here we see Clovis culture hunters killing a trapped mastodon who wandered into a shallow wetland area adjacent to the Chattahoochee River. It's now known that these mastodons are quite prevalent in North Georgia at that time. Harvard graduate and archaeologist Robert Fellowship spent much of 1939 exploring the Noocoochee Valley. At that time, the anthropology profession had known the generalities of the Clovis culture about a decade, but had no way to determine its chronology. It was assumed to be a culture located solely in the southwestern United States. Fellowship primarily was interested in the archaeological sites with visible earthworks. Nevertheless, he unearthed 35 Clovis points and some mastodon teeth while removing alluvial soil from village sites, which were many thousand years younger than the Clovis culture. The few archaeologists who heard about the discovery were dubious. Fellowship did not actually publish his report on the discoveries in North Georgia until 1966 as a booklet distributed by the Society of American Archaeology. Thus, the public was never made aware of the presence of the Clovis points in Georgia until much, much later. No paleontologists have studied sites in the Noocoochee Valley since 1939. No campsites from the Ice Age or the centuries immediately following its end have been found in North Georgia, but they may be found in the future. It is assumed that the hunter-gatherer bands lived in crude huts much of the year, then lived in caves or pit houses during the coldest months. The woodland bison, a larger, hairier relative of the western plains bison, thrived in northeast Georgia until the early 1750s. Still today, some buffalo wallows are visible there. Georgia's large herds were wiped out quickly when impoverished families from the Carolinas that Governor Wright of Georgia called crackers illegally crossed the Savannah River with their scrawny, diseased cattle. An extremely lethal microbe, probably anthrax, quickly killed off all the bison and elk in the region. For thousands of years, the probable lifestyle of the indigenous peoples of northeast Georgia and the southern highlands consisted of movement between the seasons to various campsites and temporary village sites to take advantage of whatever foods were available at that time of year. Stone circles, stone cairns, stone walls, and petroglyphs are found in many locations in northeast Georgia mountains. At this time, their age is unknown, but Most are probably thousands of years old. Some of the earliest permanent villages north of Mexico were established in the upper Chattahoochee and Etowah valleys in North Georgia. They relied on the cultivation of indigenous plants and garden plots near the houses for a major portion of their nutrition. Robert Washup discovered some villages he thought had been almost continuously occupied between around 1000 BC and 1700 AD. Mound construction was associated with many of the village sites in the upper Chattahoochee and SOQUE River valleys. They were built out of earth or stacked fieldstones. Some of the mounds may date back 3,000 years or more. Two large mounds dating from around 1000 BC were formerly located on an island in the Chattahoochee River in Robertstown, just north of Helen, Georgia. They were partially excavated by Robert Washup in 1939, but completely leveled in the late 20th century to build a parking lot and picnic grounds for tourists and tubers. The Kinnear Mound is a very large ceremonial mound that was sculpted at the top of a hill near the modern-day village of SOQUE. It is identical to the pyramidal mounds built by the Issa Mayas and the Quechua Mayas in the highlands of Chiapas, Mexico, and Guatemala. Napier partridge or pieces of pottery found on the surface of the Kinnear Mound suggest that the mound was originally constructed sometime around 600 to 700 AD. Robert Washup found a continuous chain of large villages with mounds along the Coochie Valley, the Salty Creek, Malden Mill, and SOQUE River valleys that seem to date from at least around 200 AD to around 1700 AD. In this map you see some of the major towns that are known to exist at the time of first contact between Native Americans and English-speaking settlers. However, it's clear that in between these large towns with large mounds were many, many smaller villages, some of them at least having one mound themselves. It was a very densely populated region, perhaps equally densely as populated as Mexico. One other interesting factor about these towns should be considered. They all had Mesoamerican names without exception. That may not have been the case in the past, but at least at the time in the early 1700s when English-speaking people arrived, they all were Maya words. Section of a map prepared by Jacques Lemoyne, the official artist for the Fort Caroline colony on the South Atlantic coast. It was based on the report and sketches of Lieutenant Laroche Ferrier. Ferrier spent 6 months in the Southern Highlands during 1564 and 1565. This map is based on his report and sketches submitted to Captain René de Launière, commander at Fort Caroline. Ferrier was a member of the garrison at Fort Caroline who was directed to lead a party up the Altamaha River in Georgia to the Coney River and then into the Appalachian Mountains. Appalachian is the plural of Appalachia in the Creek language. Bet you didn't know that. The Creek Indians originally called themselves Appalachia. The Florida Appalachians did not call themselves by that name. The exploration of Georgia's entire interior by 6 expeditions dispatched by Fort Caroline is not mentioned in the official Georgia history textbook. In his landmark book, published in 1873, Charles C. Jones described 2 mining villages whose timber ruins were excavated by Georgia gold miners in the late 1820s and early 1830s. The sites contain numerous 16th or 17th century mining tools plus a Spanish cigar mold. There's been absolutely no effort by archaeologists to locate these village sites, even though Georgia newspapers that era provided fairly specific information on their location. Of course, also, the presence of Spanish-speaking gold miners in 17th century Georgia is also not mentioned in the official Georgia history textbook. Florida students are told that in 1646, Spanish Governor Benito Ruiz del Salazar de Valencia ordered construction of a road between St. Augustine and the headwaters of the Chattahoochee River in what is now the Georgia mountains in order to facilitate a deerskin trade with the Appalachian Indians living there in the mountains. Of course, we mentioned earlier they were actually called the Creek Indians by the British. The Spanish also constructed a fortified trading post in the Nacuche Valley, which has footprints which are visible today, believe it or not. Georgia students are not told this information in their official history textbook. Also, there's been no effort by Georgia archaeologists to locate and excavate the Spanish trading posts. Here is a detail of a 1649 Dutch map which shows the Cherokees living just north of the St. Lawrence River and east of Lake Erie. It is an odd situation today on the subject of Spanish colonization in the Southern Highlands, particularly in the state of Georgia where most of that colonization occurred. Contemporary scholars state sarcastically in such references as Wikipedia that the presence of 17th century Spanish-speaking colonists in the Southern Highlands is highly speculative, but in fact there are numerous eyewitness accounts and an abundance of artifacts to prove their presence. Robert Walship stated in his book, The Archaeological Survey of Northern Georgia, that hundreds of European artifacts dating from the 1500s and 1600s had been found by farmers in the Nacuche Valley. These include such items as helmets, chest armor, swords, axes, construction tools, arquebuses, matchlock guns, jars, knives, spoons, tableware, and bottles. Walship was shown many of these artifacts by local residents, plus found several of such artifacts himself. This information is left out of official Georgia history textbooks and all articles on Georgia history and official references. The image here is a portion of a map of the Georgia Goldfields issued by the United States Congress in 1832. The map specifically mentions Spanish artifacts that have been found in the Nacuche Valley, plus an old Spanish mining village, Nuevo Potosi, which is a few miles south of present-day Dahlonega. The map is not presented in the official Georgia history textbook. This is a fanciful rendering of the Appalachian temple of the sun goddess Amana in the Nacuche Valley. The artists are not Deliers, exaggerated both the details of the temple and the Yonona Mountains behind it. Yona means mountain line in the Asturian language of northwestern Spain. Early white settlers changed the spelling to the Cherokee word for grizzly bear, Yona. In 1658, the Reverend Charles de Rochefort, a Protestant minister, ethnologist, and historian, published a 2-volume book on the Caribbean basins, which included 10 chapters, what he called the Appalachian Indians of French Florida, but is now mostly the state of Georgia. The chapters were based on an expedition made by British planter Richard Brickstock, who was considering moving his colony from Barbados to what is now Georgia. The illustrations in the book are based on an extensive interview with Brickstock plus his sketches. Later editions of the book benefited from a letter written on January 6, 1660 by Edward Graves, one of the directors of the European colony in northeast Georgia called Melilot. Melilot is on the colonial maps but is left out of all American history books. Brickstock described the Appalachians as the most advanced indigenous people north of Mexico. Their territory stretched from present-day southwest Virginia to what is now southwest Georgia. The High King of Appalachia told Brickstock that he had over 7,000 soldiers within 2 days' walk of the capital in the Nacuche Valley. That'll give you an idea of how densely populated North Georgia was at that time. Indeed, the chroniclers of the Hernando de Soto expedition in 1540 wrote that their conquistadors never lost sight of houses or cultivated fields while they were in the present-day state of Georgia. Brickstock stated that the Appalachian elite built stone buildings, generally round, created by laying fieldstones on clay mortar and then stuccoing them. The commoners built wood frame structures with wattle and daub clay walls. The Appalachians wore brightly patterned woven clothing. This is also mentioned by the De Soto chroniclers. They practiced a monotheistic religion in which the creator was an invisible, omnipotent, omniscient creator goddess, very similar in character to the Hebrew god, except it being a female rather than a male. Major Appalachian towns could stretch up to 3 miles along rivers or creeks. They preferred to live where there was fast-running water and waterfalls. The Orochi's book is highly respected in European universities still today, but virtually unknown in the United States. Here is why. In the early 1800s, Ivy League professors examined the book and found its description of Georgia in the 1600s to be implausible. The academicians assumed that since, in their opinion, Southern whites were backward, stupid, and cruel, Southern Indians had to be the same way. Okay? However, they were very, very wrong. Those 10 chapters contain much information that was not discovered by North Carolina archaeologists or Georgia archaeologists until late in the 20th century. South Carolina students is taught about an expedition led by Colonel James Moore in 1693 to explore what is now the northeastern tip of Georgia. The party included militia officers, Indian scouts, and a troop of mounted redcoat dragoons. They followed the old Tugaloo Trail from the headwaters of the Savannah River westward. It is now Georgia Highway 17. Coming to a mountain on the eastern edge of the Nokuchee Valley, they elected to climb up to a meadow from which they could survey the valley without being spotted by any hostile parties. The location is promised exactly where I live. The Carolinians immediately observed numerous plumes of smoke. Their Indian scouts, probably Proto-Cherokees, told the men that they were the smelting furnaces of the Spanish-speaking men who lived in the valley. They were smelting gold with the assistance of Indian laborers. The Chickasaw and Creek Indians in the valley were apparently enemies of these scouts because the scouts refused to go any further. The Carolinians realized that they were greatly outnumbered and so beat a hasty retreat back to the safety of the east side of the Savannah River. The event is not mentioned in the official Georgia history text. Instead, it states vaguely that Cherokees had been living in northeast Georgia since their construction of the mountains of their great town of Tugaloo around 1450 A.D. No one really knows where Georgia State bureaucrats and professors got this false information, which is repeated in each edition of the state's official history text. Tugaloo Mounds was excavated by the famous archaeologist Joseph Caldwell in 1957. He found the island was occupied by ancestors of the Creek Indians at least as early as 200 A.D., probably much earlier. Mound construction was begun around 800 A.D. Throughout its history, the artifacts were very similar to Proto-Creek artifacts elsewhere in Georgia. The town was burned around 1700 A.D. The Cherokees had absolutely nothing to do with the construction of the mounds. A few years after its burning, a small Yuchi village was occupied on a portion of the plaza. Colonial Georgia officials always called it a Yuchi village, not a Great Cherokee town. Tugaloo, in fact, is the mispronunciation of the word Tokele, the Creek word for freckled, and a division of the Creek Confederacy. The 1693 Morden map was the last European map to show the capital town of Appalachia located in the Nokuchee Valley. We know that in 1696 there was a horrific smallpox plague. This is probably what finally ended whatever population of Native Americans was still in the valley. Between 1886 and 1939, some of the most famous archaeologists in the United States worked in the Nokuchee Valley. Unfortunately, very little of what these gentlemen discovered is remembered today, even amongst the current generation of archaeologists. Pioneer Georgia archaeologist Charles C. Jones Jr. published his book, Antiquities of the Southern Indians, while he was living in New York City in 1873. It was the first book to make Northern scholars aware of Georgia's rich cultural heritage. By the end of the decade, it sparked interest from several museums to launch archaeological expeditions into the Southeast. However, they ignored Jones' amazingly accurate interpretations of these sites and instead tried to work the existence of these ruins into their own faulty interpretation of North America's past. Another major flaw of the early archaeological work in the Southeast was that the archaeologists were primarily interested in obtaining trophy artifacts to give to their wealthy patrons in the Northeast or to museums in the Northeast. Hundreds of mounds in the Southeast were destroyed by these early archaeologists in the search for trophies. The Bureau of Ethnology was established in 1879 by an act of Congress for the purpose of transferring archives, records, and materials relating to the Indians of North America from the Interior Department to the Smithsonian Institution. One of its first activities was the Hayden expedition, when it went out west in 1879 to study the natural history of the region. In 1881, Cyrus Thomas was named chief archaeologist for the Bureau of Ethnology and put in charge of its mound exploration program. The goal of the program was to determine who built the thousands of mounds in the United States. After first focusing on dozens of mounds, in particular in Ohio and along the Ohio River Valley, Cyrus then shifted his attention to the Deep South, where he decided to investigate several of the mounds mentioned by Jones's book. Much of the work of the Smithsonian in the Southeast was focused on the Etowah Mounds in northwest Georgia. Thomas chose his cousin, John Rogan, to be superintendent of the excavations. This was unfortunate. The only qualification that Rogan had was being a Union Army veteran from Tennessee. Otherwise, he had no qualifications in archaeology, anthropology, or history. There were constant complaints from Thomas in letters to his cousin stating that he was not obtaining enough trophy artifacts for the museums in the Northeast. Eventually, Rogan was fired for that, but they did take some trips together to other parts of North Georgia. Toward the end of the time of the Smithsonian dig at Etowah Mounds, Thomas traveled down to Georgia and asked Rogan to accompany on a tour of potential mound sites for future digs in North Georgia. They took a buggy eastward to the Nacoochee Valley, where they inspected the Nacoochee Mound and dug some test holes. They then continued eastward and then northward by horseback to SOQUE, Georgia, which was high up in the mountains. According to Thomas's report, the two met with the postmaster, J.D. Hill, in SOQUE, who showed him numerous stone ruins and earthworks in the vicinity of the post office, and then told them there were many more sites in the SOQUE area up and down the SOQUE River. However, they were running out of time, so they then continued on their journey southeastward to the Tugaloo River, where they looked at the Tugaloo Mounds and actually excavated to them on the Georgia side of the river. When Cyrus Thomas returned to Washington, D.C., he sent a letter to James Mooney, who was an ethnologist based at the Cherokee Reservation in western North Carolina. He asked Mooney to travel down to North Georgia and study the ruins around SOQUE, to continue on and study reported stone ruins at Alec Mountain, and then to study the Nacoochee Mound. Mooney tells us very little about that journey. They do not appear in any of the books he published after the fact, other than a brief mention of the Nacoochee Mound and the SOQUE tribe. He determined wrongly that SOQUE was an ancient Cherokee word whose meaning is forgotten. Actually, it's a SOQUE Mixtec word that means civilized people, and the descendants of the SOQUE are the Miccosukee in Florida. Nevertheless, Mooney did go to Alec Mountain. We know he was there. He briefly mentioned it, said nothing about it, and that's how the situation remained for many decades. Cyrus Thomas's report on the work done in Georgia was published in 1891. This is all he says. Stone circle 85 feet in diameter with walls originally 4 feet high on Alec Mountain, 7 miles northeast of Clarksville, reported by James Mooney. The United States Geological Service prepared a special high-resolution topographic map of North Georgia to be used by the Smithsonian for documenting the archaeological discoveries. But instead, when Cyrus Thomas and James Mooney published their reports, they used a very crude map from which no one could discern any location. Confounding features confusion in the 21st century, SOQUE changed its name to Batesville in 1855, then in approximately 1873 changed it back to SOQUE. Then in 1921 changed the name back to Batesville. When Cyrus Thomas's Mound Report was published as a bound book in 1925, the publisher could not find the name of a town named SOQUE, so they changed the name to Salty in the final version. By then, the Salty post office had been moved 3 miles, so it was impossible for future generations of historians and archaeologists to find the actual locations of SOQUE and Salty. In 1915, the wealthy industrialist George Hay hired a team of archaeologists to excavate the Nacuche Mound in search of trophy artifacts primarily. He paid a brief visit to Alex Mountain, dug a few holes, didn't see any evidence of valuable artifacts, and therefore ignored the site and made only a brief mention of his visit to the stone ruins. During the 1930s, a Boy Scout troop in Habersham County adopted Alex Mountain as its pet project. For a period between the 1930s, 40s, and 50s and early 60s, this troop maintained the site, kept it clear of trees, also established a parking lot on Alex Mountain Road, and generally made the site attractive visitation. It is known that by the 1940s, Alex Mountain had become a major tourist attraction, one of the most important in North Georgia. It was a must-see whenever a tourist visited the North Georgia mountains. Archaeologist Robert Fellowship was working in the Nacuche Valley in 1939. He paid a visit to Alex Mountain. At that time, he described it as being well maintained by the Boy Scout troop. He also saw no evidence of important artifacts there and never really excavated the site. In 1956, archaeologist Philip E. Smith with Harvard University obtained a grant to do a survey of stone ruins in North Georgia. One of the many sites he visited was the Alex Mountain ruins, and in this time he brought along laborers from the local community in order to excavate it. The laborers employed by Smith dug 2 ditches cross-shaped across the ruins plus some test pits. They found no significant artifacts. Philip Smith did prepare a measured drawing of the site. You can see the ditches they dug today. It's very visible where they worked. However, Smith went away not knowing who built the site and what its purpose was. At some point in the late 1960s, early 70s, the Boy Scout troop stopped maintaining the Alex Mountain archaeological zone and began to grow up in vegetation. We do know that in the 1970s, the county government changed the right-of-way for Alex Mountain Road, and in the process graded away the public parking lot and the trail leading from there to the archaeological site. In his now famous book, Myth of the Cherokee, ethnologist James Mooney made a statement which quickly caught my eye. He said that the original name of the large Native American town in the Nacuche Valley was Itziti. Mooney stated that Itziti was an ancient Cherokee word whose meaning has been lost. It is not. Itziti is what the Itzamayas called themselves. It's also the name that most of the Georgia Creeks call themselves. There might be a connection there. In 2014, I was just coming off the tail of the controversy created by the premiere of the History Channel series America Unearthed, which focused on my discovery of Itzamaya stone ruins and name places in Georgia, plus Itzamaya words in the Creek language. For the next 3 years, I would focus my research on the Nacuche Valley. This work ultimately resulted in the publication of the Nacuche Valley, Crossroads of the Americas. It has become my best-selling book to date. I never could find the Alex Mountain stone circle of the town of SOQUE before publication of the book in 2017. SOQUE was not on any current maps and no one locally had ever heard of it. Even after moving to the Nacuche Valley in May of 2018, I was still unable to find these archaeological zones. I first talked to the post office staff in Salty, and they had never heard of a SOQUE post office. They referred me to the Southeastern Regional Historian of the U.S. Postal Service. They had no record of any post office ever being located in a town named SOQUE. I was not the Lone Ranger when it came to the mystery of SOQUE. In 1939, Robert Worship had tried to find the many amazing stone ruins and mounds described by Cyrus Thomas, but Worship was using the 1925 hardbound version of Thomas's Georgia report. It had changed the name to SOQUE to Saltee, if you recall, but Thomas also described significant archaeological sites at a village named Saltee. But Saltee had just moved 3 miles when the book was published. Worship could also find none of the ruins around the new village of Saltee that Thomas had described. Like me, Worship was puzzled why the village of Saltee was not adjacent to Saltee Creek. Gringo archaeologists seem to have a deep fear of historic maps. Robert Worship certainly did. They'd really never consult them. Otherwise, Worship would have known that in 1886, Batesville was SOQUE, Saltee was called CHATTAHOOCHEE, Saltee was on Saltee Creek, near the intersection of Georgia highways 25 and 25A. Finally, it all made sense. For 2 months after arriving here in the valley, I asked many people in the CHATTAHOOCHEE Valley Community Center where the Alex Mountain Stone Circle was. No one knew. Most people were transplants who arrived here in the past 10 to 30 years. I even questioned living on Alex Mountain Road. They were in their 30s and 40s and never heard of the Alex Mountain Stone Circle. In fact, one of the ladies actually grown up at the foot of Alex Mountain but had never heard of it. I contacted the office of the Northeast Georgia Regional Council of Boy Scouts of America. They were initially very interested in helping me, trying to find the troop that sponsored that site for so many decades, but then suddenly became cold as ice. Anything to say beyond that would be speculative, but probably right on target. But then I stopped by Fritchie's Farm Market on Highway 17, next to Alex Mountain Road. You can see Alex Mountain from the store. I discovered 2 local residents eating raw corn who remembered as children tourists going to the Alex Mountain Stone Circle. Then Alan Fritchie, the owner, overheard us and told me exactly where the ruins were and how to reach them. On a beautiful spring morning, I drove up Alex Mountain Road and found the ancient rampway leading to the ruins. The site had a magnificent view of Yonah Mountain. There was also no trespassing signs posted all along the road. I initially went to the courthouse and obtained the names of landowners on Alex Mountain. I sent letters to all the owners via U.S. mail and waited 6 months for reply. None did. We're looking at the ramp that once led up to the stone oval on top of Alex Mountain. As you see now, it's densely vegetated, but farther up on the slopes, interesting enough, there are stone boulders and actually smaller stone walls that apparently marked some type of ornamental, ceremonial procession as it curved up the slopes. What has happened is that the main road was, as you see here, this is Alex Mountain Road. I'm sweeping around to it, then looking down to the west, was regraded back in the 1960s. And when they did this, they destroyed the parking lot and the hiking path to get up to the oval. And the next generation of local people, those that stayed in the area, again, we're going to look back up the trail a bit. Here we go. Forgot that these ruins even existed. It's an amazing story. How could something of this importance be forgotten? But it was. And so today, most of the people in Habersham County, where the site is located, don't even know it exists. Finally, in March 2019, Mr. Fritchie put me in contact with the owner, who agreed to give me a tour of the site. It was quite a ride. He had an all-terrain vehicle that went up and down the mountains and everywhere. It was worth the trip. I would have paid for it, in fact, just to have the experience. The following day, a team of volunteers joined me on a hike up Alex Mountain. The site was now so densely wooded that it was impossible to get good photos or videos, even in the middle of the winter, but I was able to measure the ruins precisely. None of the archaeologists had mentioned that the ruins were tilted on an approximately 10% slope, and they composed an oval rotated about 15 degrees north-northwest. They also did not mention that the stone ruins of an altar were on the upper end of the ellipse. The owner of the Alec Mountain ruins had mentioned to me that he thought there was a mound along Amos Creek on the south side of Alec Mountain Road. You can see it here in the illustration. The mound had formerly been much higher, but the county road department had scooped off about 15 or 20 feet from the top. After coming down the slopes and drove by the site, it certainly looked man-made. That night I examined topographic maps and satellite imagery. It was an oval mound about 25 feet high, 315 feet long, and 145 feet wide, the same size as an ancient ball stadium that we found on Malden Mill Creek in February. The next day I returned and filmed the site once I was sure that this was a mound. Hello, this is Richard Thornton coming to you from the newly discovered Arnold Mound. I say newly discovered is because archaeologists twice went past this mound. Back in 1939 with Robert Wauchop, and in 1886 with Cyrus Thomas of the Smithsonian. They went right past this mound either on horseback or a Model T and went nearby to the Alec Mountain Stone Circle without noticing that this was one of the largest mounds in North Georgia. It is enormous. It's about 350 feet long and 150 feet wide. It has a ramp on the north side. It's tilted at about 15 degrees northwest. Originally, it was about somewhere in the range of 35 to 40 feet high. About 20 years ago, the county government skimmed off 15 feet off the top, but as you can see, it is still quite large. We'll zero in. There's the bank. You can see there along the bank. That'll give it out to the side. That's about 25 feet right there. We're looking now at the ramp from the north section of the mound. It actually extends into a causeway that links up to the mountain to our northeast where the Alec Mountain Stone Circle is. We're going to do a big sweep here. Sweeping around. And that is the location of the Alec Mountain Stone Circle. Looking off in that direction. We'll pan up there a little bit. There, see? Now, we're going to move around, again rotating to there, and you see a house, a green house, that is sitting on top of a large burial mound. We're now on top of the mound, looking to the southwest. It is not clear what created that step. It could be that the excavators made that terrace, but on the other hand, there is a terrace on the nearby Kennemer Mound, which has a very similar shape to this mound, except the Kennemer Mound is not as large as this mound. As I said, this mound is the size of an American football field. We're sweeping around. Now we're going to go on the highest point in the mound and look back down at it. We're now going to do a panoramic sweep of the mound. I'm now looking to the northeast directly at Alec Mountain, a very important archaeological site on top of this mound. Now we're going to sweep around the top to get an idea of the view that one would have had from the top of this mound. There are some stones up here. It's not clear if they're part of a structure, if they were hauled up here, or else at one time this was a natural formation in which the builders sculptured into being a mound. Now that is a possibility because the Kennemer Mound actually was sculpted from the top of a hill. On the other hand, it's clearly there are ramps here. These stones may be part of structures. It's not, as I said, this has been altered by the work of bulldozers hauling dirt, but the stones aren't naturally laying flat, they're at an angle. So it's no telling what was up here originally. Only an archaeological study that thoroughly examined a cross-section of the mound could tell us whether it was a sculpted mound like the Kennemere Mound, which is very common in the Itzamayas, or it's actually a large man-made mound completely in which stones have been dragged up here for structures. One of the most interesting features of this mound is that it was built or sculptured inside of a pond or swamp. Part of that swamp is still there, but it has a stream running through it, Amos Creek. You see here it's a steep drop of about 25 feet here. But it would have had an effect of being a fortress, and the combination of the water and the steep slopes of the mound would have made it not only a religious place, but also a place where one could make a last stand if necessary. The next step was taking detailed measurements of the mound and environs so I could create an accurate virtual reality drawing of the environment of the mound and the Alex Mountain Stone Circle. It was very obvious that the mound had been constructed within a swamp or a pond, probably a pond. It was at a location where two streams joined and were intentionally dammed to create a body of water around the dam. The roads used by Native Americans became the roads used by early settlers until Alex Mountain Road was regraded in the 1970s. In the following months of 2019, we would discover dozens of earthen mounds, stone cairns, stone walls, petroglyphs, and earthworks in the Alex Mountain area. However, the initial discoveries that weekend in March 2019 were astonishing enough. The Alex Mountain Stone Oval seemed to be very ancient. So did some of the other stone structures in the area. However, all of these structures were precisely related to each other geometrically. We noticed that many of the older stone structures were around 1,700 to 1,800 feet above sea level and had spectacular views of Yonah Mountain. The newly discovered Arnold Mound was perpendicular to a slot in the wall of the Alex Mountain Stone Oval, even though the two structures were 2,485 feet apart and 400 feet different in elevation. Aligned to the Arnold Mound were numerous small mounds and stone cairns. They were all triangulated to true north-south, true east-west, and the azimuth of the winter solstice sunset. The SOQUE and Maya calendars begin on the winter solstice sunset. Who built these structures? It may always be impossible to determine who built the Alex Mountain Stone Oval and the other stone structures. However, a neighbor of the Arnold Mound had profound evidence on who built it. She showed me a handful of Swift Creek complicated stamp party shards. I knew that the Swift Creek culture people abandoned the portion of Georgia south of the fall line after a comet or asteroid struck the ocean off Cape Canaveral, Florida in 539 AD. The tsunami that struck the Georgia coast was at least 100 feet high because the debris ridge is still 85 feet high at Darien, Georgia. It probably was much higher and also violently flooded most of the coastal plain. However, the Swift Creek pottery was no longer made at Kalamucky Mounds a couple centuries earlier. It was replaced by Weedon Island pottery, which was associated with a South American people in the Florida Panhandle that the Spanish incorrectly labeled Appalachia. So maybe these people traveled earlier to the Georgia mountains than the end of Kalamucky. Out of curiosity, I compared the geometry of the Arnold Mound with the largest mound at Kalamucky. Astonishingly, they were identical. Both were rotated about 15 degrees to the north-northwest. Evidently, the same people built both mounds. Which mound came first can only be answered by archaeologists. I was also curious to see if the slot in the Alex Mountain Oval aligned with some prominent features of the landscape. And indeed it did. It aligned both with Waka Mountain, which is southwest of Cleveland, Georgia, and also at a much longer distance, Kennesaw Mountain in northwest metro Atlanta. This is fascinating. How could they see that far? Maybe the air was clear back then. In our next documentary, we will examine the discoveries made immediately west of the Arnold Mound in the Ames Creek Valley. Even though they're side by side, here the architecture and pottery styles are very different than those at Alex Mountain and near the Arnold Mound. The terrain is more level and thus more conducive to large-scale agriculture. However, it's very likely that at some point in time, the same peoples lived in both locations. Here we will see a mound that's identical in shape and size to a large mound that once existed on the Savannah River near Elberton, Georgia. We will see a 345 feet long stone effigy in the shape of a ceremonial Maya mace. We will see a large sculptured boulder in the shape of a coiled snake. It's immediately in back of my house, about 200 yards. It also has what appears to be a seated ruler with the top of his torso been cut off. Here's a close view of the arm and the waist of the seated ruler. A University of North Georgia professor took a photograph of this 11-foot long petroglyphic boulder. It appears to be something of the character of the late Olmec civilization or the Maya civilization. Right now, the owners will not let us get close to it to measure it and photograph it, but someday we will. As it is, what we tell you today, the facts are, may change tomorrow. Until later, folks.